Okay. All right, so if you would, turn in your Bibles, if you would. Before you go to Habakkuk, turn to Psalm 73. Psalm 73. We will get to Habakkuk momentarily. Psalm 73. What is probably one of the most common questions about the human condition? When we look into the world and we see kind of the world around us, I'd say, I'll just give you question one. Question one we're probably tempted to ask is, where did we come from? Where did we come from? Where did all of this come from? How did we get here? How did this happen? But then we're kind of going through life and things happen to us, things happen around us. And then what's probably the most common question we ask, it's 3 simple letters, but it's so hard. What is the question we ask? Why? We start asking that question from the time that we can talk. And we often don't get any answer. Jilly was asking me this morning in the car about something. I had asked her to do something, and her question to me was, why? Why? There's so many times that things happen around us, things happen to us, things happen to other people. We watch the news, and we ask the question, why? Why? And we want an answer. We want an answer. We want to be able to explain all the things that happen around us. And it better be a good explanation, because if the explanation is somehow incomplete, open-ended, or not satisfactory, what's the next question we're going to ask? Why? Well, you got to go to school. Why? Because you got to learn things. Why? Well, because you're going to need that later in life. Why? And so you could go on and on and on about all the whys. Here's the problem. You're not always going to get an answer to that question. And that's a dilemma that you're going to have to deal with, or you're not going to make it very long in this life. Sometimes the why is just because, and sometimes the why is, I could tell you the answer and you're just not going to understand it. Ladies and gentlemen, the book of Habakkuk I present to you. That is Habakkuk's dilemma. You know, again, we're looking at a situation, we might say, why is this happening? Or in particular, why is this happening to me? Then we kind of look at it from the other side. Why isn't someone doing something about this? You might see a situation on the news. I was watching the news the other day, or reading the news the other day, and there's a situation in Ethiopia right now where armed forces from the north and the Tigray region are making their way southward, and they are just annexing. They are, it's not quite a coup yet, but it's getting to that point, and things are looking pretty bleak. And as such, in addition to COVID, their supply lines are being cut off, and there is the potential for another famine in the country of Ethiopia in the near future because of this military, I don't even know what to call it. And so we look at that and you say, we are the most powerful nation on the planet. People respect us, we hope so. People respect us. Why isn't somebody, the president, Congress, governors, whoever, the generals, why aren't they going to Ethiopia and saying, stop doing this? Can't you see that it's just hurting your people? It's weakening your country. Your infrastructure is going to suffer. Nothing good could come of this. Why isn't somebody doing something? Or maybe let's get kind of bigger. Why isn't God doing something? I think we might have said something about that in our class this morning. We can be tempted to look and we say, well, if we have an all-loving God, right? all loving, all powerful, all present. He can do anything he wants to, and nothing can hold itself against his will or his command. Why isn't he doing something about this? Why is he just sitting there? Why haven't we heard anything from him? Why? And again, we'll go in circles. Now, I want to think in particular about situations where maybe something bad is happening to a good person, but maybe also a situation where something good is happening for a bad person on behalf of a bad person. And we look at those situations contrast and we say, why would this be happening? You might think of the early church, right? Here you have people that are fully devoted to God. They are risking their lives to meet in homes or wherever they can. And they're being persecuted by Rome. They're being strung up. They're being put in cages and set on fire. And Rome is just prospering. Rome is just doing its Rome thing. Why? Why are the good people allowed to suffer and the bad people allowed to just continue on? And so really, I would say in many ways, our faith, our personal faith is defined by our ability to cope with our questions, especially when there isn't a direct or an immediate answer to those questions. You know, you can look in the Psalms and find a whole lot of instances where some bad things are happening to bad people. I mean, a lot of the Psalms are written by David, and we know a lot of the bad stuff that happens in his life. But if you look in particular at Psalm 73, Psalm 73 is a psalm of Asaph. I don't know the context of the psalm, but if I read through it, I can very quickly gain some insight into Asaph's mindset. Let's start in verse 1. God is indeed good to Israel, to the pure in heart. That's a great start, right? God is good to the pure in heart. If that was the end of the psalm, no problem. Verse 2, but as for me, my feet nearly slipped. My steps nearly went astray. For I envied the arrogant. I saw the prosperity of the wicked. They have an easy time until they die, and their bodies are well fed. They're not in trouble like others. They're not afflicted like most people. Therefore, pride is their necklace, and violence covers them like a garment. Their eyes bulge out from fatness. The imaginations of their hearts run wild. They mock and they speak maliciously. They arrogantly threaten oppression. They set their mouths against heaven, and their tongues strut across the earth. Therefore, his people, God's people, turn to them and drink in their overflowing waters. They say, how can God know? Does the Most High know everything? Look at them, the wicked. They're always at ease, and they increase their wealth. Here's the dilemma. Did I purify my heart and wash my hands in innocence for nothing? For I'm afflicted all day long and punished every morning. If I had decided to say these things aloud, I would have betrayed your people. When I tried to understand all this, though, it all seemed hopeless. I want to stop right there. I know if you read on in the psalm, and I would encourage you to do so, you'll see a turning point there. But this feels so bleak, doesn't it? We look around us and we see the fat getting fatter. We see the wicked getting wickeder. We see the rich getting richer. And all the while, people are suffering. Who's doing something about that? And why aren't they getting what we feel that they deserve in order to kind of even the scales? This is the dilemma that Habakkuk is going to face. Let's take a look for a minute at Habakkuk's setting. You can go ahead and turn your Bibles to Habakkuk. But I want to do a very small amount of background to bring us up to Habakkuk's time, and maybe we'll see why he's asking some of the questions that he's asking, and get a sense of the scenario that he's seeing around him. Okay? So, we just finished talking about the fall of Nineveh. Remember, that's what Nahum prophesied about. So in 612 BC, as Nahum prophesied, Nineveh was destroyed by a coalition led by the Babylonians. It wasn't just the Babylonians. They had also contracted with the Arameans and the Medes and the Persians. And so this joint force came up against Assyria, and Nineveh fell, which started the dominoes falling against Assyria. When in a few short years, Assyria was gone. The most powerful empire on the earth to date was gone. No more. And so Babylon takes over the scene. Now, let's bring it a little bit closer to home to our story. In Judah, about this time, King Josiah instituted nationwide reform after what event? What had happened for Josiah to begin that reform? They found the law in the temple. That's right. Okay. Well, why do you think the law was missing? His father, who was? Okay. Josiah's father was Manasseh. That's right. Okay, we forget Hezekiah, Manasseh, Josiah. Manasseh was a wicked king. He was one of the worst kings that Judah ever had. Now, he did experience a turning point late in his life, but basically through his reign, which was also one of the longest in either of the kingdoms, the temple had fallen into complete disrepair. So Josiah comes in, the boy king. Josiah comes in, and through his tenure, he institutes a renovation of the temple. And they're going through, and somebody just happens to stumble across this scroll or tablet or whatever it's on. Lo and behold, this is the law, not the law, the law, the Torah, right? And for whatever reason, they've been living their lives up to this point without knowing what this is. Now, what were the kings supposed to do in terms of the law? Way back when the law was originally given. Mike's doing it right now. What was it? They were supposed to write a copy of it. That's right. They were supposed to write a copy of it. So what do you think it says about Judah, Israel, whoever, to this date, that only one copy of the law is there, and nobody's been copying it down for who knows how long? Probably since Solomon's time, at least. Okay, so they find a copy of the law, and Josiah says, let's read this thing and figure out what we're supposed to do. What was Josiah's reaction after he read the law? We got problems, right? We got problems, because I'm looking around and what we're doing and how we're living does not match up to what's in this. So if we're going to obey, if we're going to believe that God is who he says he is, and most likely that law includes the covenant blessings and curses, if we're not doing what we're supposed to do, then this stuff is going to fall down on us. And I know that there is some movement to the north. So we need to get right. And that's what Josiah does. He says, we are going to get right. And so in Judah, King Josiah institutes nationwide reform. He starts knocking down idols, high places. It is the most comprehensive reform in Judah to date. Okay, and this is a large task, again, after the reigns of both Manasseh and Josiah's father, Ammon. But in 609, Josiah goes into battle against Egyptian forces, and those Egyptian forces are marching north. They're marching north to go confront Babylon at Carchemish, a battle that they will eventually lose. But they're going to the north to confront Carchemish, and against advice, Josiah goes out against the Egyptians into battle, and he is killed in the line of battle on the plain of Megiddo. And you can read about that in 2 Chronicles chapter 35. Now, Josiah dies, and so he has to be succeeded. He is succeeded by his wicked son, Jehoahaz. Jehoahaz doesn't last very long. 3 months he's on the throne. Jehoahaz is so bad, he is assassinated by his own people after 3 months. That's the kind of thing that happened in Israel towards the end of that kingdom. And now it started happening in Judah. So Jehoahaz is assassinated, and his brother Jehoiakim, also Josiah's son, takes the throne. Now, Jehoiakim, as we read in the text, Jehoiakim was a puppet king who reversed much of the good that his father had done. And so when Jehoiakim comes in, first of all, he's originally under the thumb of Egypt, and then he's under the thumb of Babylon, and he doesn't like any of this stuff. And so he just kind of starts living and corrupting Judah. And he ignores all the prophetic words of another prophet in Judah at this time. It's one that we have a pretty big book from. Anybody know who that is? Jeremiah. That's exactly right. Jeremiah also prophesied during the time of Jehoiakim. We're going to have to keep those straight because there's another one in a second. Jehoiakim. Now Jeremiah prophesies through many of the last kids. He prophesies on into, his book goes on into the exile. But Habakkuk and Jeremiah are contemporaries. Now, it is most likely during this time then that Habakkuk also prophesies. Do you remember one of the things that Jehoiakim did that was so bad during Jeremiah's time? It's recorded in Jeremiah's book. Do you remember that the law is being read, and what does Jehoiakim do?
He takes a knife and cuts it because he doesn't like what it says.
He systematically disassembles the law. Now, look at those two contrasts. We have Josiah, who finds the law, and he panics because he says, we need to do what the Lord wants. We need to follow the law. Let's stop everything and reform. Then his son Jehoiakim comes in. The law is being read to him, and he is systematically and surgically getting rid of the law, line by line by line. He is literally cutting the law apart and throwing it into the fire. A tale of 2 generations, folks. That's how quickly it can decline. Okay? This is the setting into which Habakkuk comes onto the scene, most likely. Now, when we look at Habakkuk, we don't have Jehoiakim mentioned, but from the time period and some of the things that Habakkuk says, we can surmise that it is most likely in this time period that Habakkuk reigns, which would make him one of the last post-exile or pre-exile prophets. So what Habakkuk has to say and what Habakkuk is going to see and the conclusions that he comes to are very important for the next part of the story. All right, let's kind of look at the rest of this history and then come back to this point. Now, what we know is after this point, over the next few years, Babylon continues to expand and thrive, and they conquer and annex lands just the same way that the Assyrians did. And they become a vast empire very quickly. And so the king of Babylon at this point is Nebuchadnezzar. He is the same king that we see at the beginning of the book of Daniel, and there's a reason for that. In 605, Nebuchadnezzar begins a series of campaigns against the Syria-Palestine area. He comes down into the area where Judah is, and he is conquering lands throughout that area. His first campaign in 605 is in along the Mediterranean coastline. So it's basically the territory that the Philistines once occupied. And he comes down to Ashkelon, and he essentially enters into a stalemate with Egypt right there at Ashkelon. And so then the second campaign in 598 is where the first assault against Jerusalem takes place, and thus the first deportations. The first exiles go away around 598. Who was among the first exiles? Daniel was. That's exactly right. Daniel, and by extension, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, among many others, were among those first exiles. So when we get to the book of Daniel in February, this is where we're picking up. But that's not the only that's not the only deportations. In 587, he begins another campaign, and they have not gone away through any of this by any means. The last kings of Judah were all vassal kings to Babylon. They were puppets, especially Zedekiah. But in 587, the final siege of Jerusalem happens in response to Zedekiah's rebellion. Zedekiah tries to rebel against Babylon. He tries to make some alliances. It goes completely wrong for him, and Babylon is very swift in their judgment. So Babylon comes down against Jerusalem, and this is where the city is essentially not completely destroyed, but it is ransacked, looted, and the temple is burned. This is where we leave Judah at the time of the exile. Consequently, this is just kind of a side note. Consequently, for means of chronology, this is also a time when Edom, their cousins of Israel, come up and start helping to loot Jerusalem. And they're going to be remembered for that, because the book of Obadiah is the response to them coming up and gloating over Judah's demise. Okay, so if we're able to get to Obadiah, that's what that's going to be about. All right, let's go back to Habakkuk. Back to Habakkuk. Here we go. Habakkuk chapter 1. Habakkuk is another one of those prophets that plays out a little bit different from what we might call a normal prophecy. We don't look in Habakkuk 1 verse 1 and say, here is the word of the Lord, and then he starts pronouncing things. Habakkuk plays out around a series of questions and responses between Habakkuk and God, which ends in a personal psalm describing Habakkuk's eventual mindset. So you get a basic structure of the book here. Does structure make things a little bit easier with these prophets? A little bit? Okay, all right. A lot of you said that was very helpful last week, and I'm glad that was the case with Nahum. But this is basically how the book falls out. We have Habakkuk's first complaint in chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. This is the why, right? I don't know if Habakkuk was expecting an answer, but he gets one, and he gets one in dramatic fashion. And when he gets that answer, he probably wishes he hadn't asked the question in the first place, right? So God gives that answer in chapter 1, verses 5 through 11. These are what we're going to cover tonight. That's going to be the rest of our time tonight. And then we will pick up next time with the second complaint from Habakkuk, which is a response to the Lord's initial response in chapter 1, 12 through the end of that chapter, and then God's reply in chapter 2. Now, what we're going to see is, based on God's reply, the reply is not conclusive. There's no finality to it in terms of, well, what's going to happen next? What's going to become of us? We'll get that in some other books. Zephaniah talks about kind of what's going to happen next for the country and how God's going to redeem his people. But there's not a whole lot in Habakkuk. So that's going to be chapter 2, verse 20. And then we get this very last chapter, Habakkuk chapter 3, which is probably the one we're most familiar with if we've read this book. And first of all, he talks about how the Lord is a warrior. We see that in many of the prophets. And then this final statement, which is probably the one that we're most familiar with, Habakkuk's trust in the Lord. So he's going to reach an end point in this book that is much more hopeful than where he starts. All right, let's look at Habakkuk chapter 1 and pick up in verses 1 through 4. The oracle or burden that Habakkuk the prophet saw. How long, Lord, must I call for help? And you do not listen, or cry out to you about violence, and you do not save. Why do you force me to look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Oppression and violence are right in front of me. Strife is ongoing, and conflict escalates. This is why the law is ineffective, and justice never emerges. For the wicked restrict the righteous, therefore justice comes out perverted. All right, so this phrase, how long? How long? This is not an uncommon phrase for those that are familiar with the Psalms. Habakkuk's words read very much like a psalm. Remember, we said that about Jonah's prayer. Habakkuk's responses really play out like a psalm. So, for instance, turn over to Psalm chapter 89. We're going to look at Psalm 89 and 90 real quick and see some similarities in the language here. Psalm 89. Psalm 89 begins very positively and talks about how the Lord is from everlasting, how all creation bends to him, and happy are the people who know the joyful shout. Lord, they walk in the light of your presence. Let me see. Let me skip down here. Sorry, I lost where I was going to. Oh, here it is. Okay. Verse 38. Verse 38. In verse 36, it says, his offspring will continue forever, his throne like the sun before me, like the moon established forever, a faithful witness in the sky. The offspring of the faithful. But, verse 38, but you have spurned and rejected him. You have become enraged with your anointed. You have repudiated the covenant with your servant. You have completely dishonored his crown. You have broken down all his walls. You've reduced his fortified cities to ruins. All who pass by plunder him. He's become a joke to his neighbors. You've lifted high the right hand of his foes. You've made all his enemies rejoice. You've also turned back his sharp sword and have not let him stand in battle. You've made his splendor cease and have overturned his throne. You shortened the days of his youth and covered him with shame. How long, Lord? How long? Will you hide yourself forever? Will your anger keep burning like fire? Remember how short my life is. Have you created everyone for nothing? What man can live and never see death? Who can save himself from the power of Sheol? Lord, where are the former acts of your faithful love that you swore to David in your faithfulness? Remember, Lord, the ridicule against your servants. In my heart, I carry abuse from all the peoples. How your enemies have ridiculed, Lord. How they have ridiculed every step of your anointed. May the Lord be praised forever and ever. Amen. It's kind of a sudden ending there, isn't it? Then you look at the very next psalm. Lord, you've been our refuge and our strength before the mountains were born. You gave birth. You returned mankind to the dust, saying, return. And they're like grass that grows in the morning. In the morning it sprouts and grows. By evening it withers and dries up. Verse 7, for we are consumed by your anger. We are terrified by your wrath. You've set our unjust ways before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. For all our days ebb away under your wrath. We end our years like a sigh. Our lives last 70 years, or if we're strong, 80 years. Even the best of them are struggle and sorrow. Indeed, they pass away quickly and we fly away. Who understands the power of your anger? Your wrath matches the fear that is due you. Teach us to number our days carefully. Lord, how long? Turn and have compassion on your servants. Who wrote Psalm 90? Look up, you might have a subheading. Moses wrote Psalm 90. Remember I said, as long as we've been able to talk, we've been asking the question, why? Moses was asking the question, why? So if Moses is asking the question, why, and we know Moses' character, and we know Moses standing before the Lord, is it sinful to ask this question? When you're looking around you, and you're seeing, Lord, everything around me is going wrong. This country is going down the toilet. Is it sinful for us to say, Lord, how long are you going to sit there and just watch this? You see every murder. You see every rape. You see every injustice. How long are you going to sit there? Is it wrong for us to ask that question? We got to grapple with that. I'm seeing yeses, I'm seeing no's.
Because that's what the saints in Revelation is saying, how long, O Lord?
Okay.
It's just how we feel. It's not wrong to feel that way.
Yep.
It's wrong to have a wrong response. And when you take that to the Lord, that's the right response.
Okay.
When you say, I'm going to go, Lord, I'm tired of blaming. I'm going to go fix this problem.
Yeah.
That's the wrong response. But when you feel that way, you turn to the Lord and ask the question, accepting whatever the answer is. If the answer is, I'm sorry, you're just going to have to wait.
Right.
Then you accept that answer, then that's fine. It's only when you stop accepting the answer and say, I'm sorry, God, I'm going to go find another solution.
I'm done. Yep, I'm done. Ed, did you have something you were going to say?
You say Job was a pretty righteous man.
Yeah. Yes, he did. That Job was a righteous man who asked that same question. It's a question that's asked throughout Scripture. And I don't think it's sinful to ask that question. How long, Lord? How long are you gonna sit there? But look at some of the language that Habakkuk uses. Okay, go back to Habakkuk. Everywhere Habakkuk looks, he sees evil at hand. This is akin to Genesis 6:5, right? Everywhere the Lord looked, evil was set on the hearts of men. Okay, and so that's what Habakkuk is seeing. So you just look at some of the things that he says. What does Habakkuk see? He sees violence. He sees injustice. He sees iniquity. He sees oppression. He sees disregard for people and for God. He sees strife between people. He sees contention everywhere. This is what Habakkuk sees in God's people, or the people who are supposed to be God's people. People who up until just a few years ago were living under the reforms of Josiah. They had turned back to God and gotten rid of their idols. And notice Habakkuk's frustration when he can't reconcile his surroundings and what he's seeing with God's goodness. I call, you don't listen. I cry, you don't save. I observe everything that's happening around me. You observe and tolerate. You stand back. Nothing is happening. How long, Lord, are you going to wait? Now, I have the benefit of seeing the rest of Habakkuk's book here. I think I have a pretty good sense of Habakkuk's kind of his headspace. But isn't it frustrating to see all that around us and say, this thing just keeps getting worse and worse? How much longer, Lord, are you going to let this go? Or how much longer are you going to wait until you send somebody? This is Habakkuk's dilemma. And so Habakkuk's conclusion there, based on this question in verse 4, Habakkuk's conclusion is that God's perceived inactivity is the reason that the law is ineffective. Eddie.
And I think we have that feeling most vividly when something bad happens to us.
Yes.
That's when we really become clear and say, oh, this is a wicked world. Something needs to be done. That's when we cry out to God, make it right.
Yes. Yep.
And we don't always get an answer.
Well, and quite often it's because of fear, isn't it? You know, it's not always because of our concern for the Lord's name. And a lot of times it's fear. And so fear can drive us. So as Mike said, what is our motivation? What is our motivation? And so Habakkuk's conclusion based on this is, you know, God's perceived inactivity is the reason that the law is just ineffective. The capital L law is ineffective. It has no teeth. There's nothing to this. Habakkuk has read about how when the children of Israel complained in the wilderness, God acted. Habakkuk has read about how when Achan sinned from his greed, God acted. He's read about in David's time when David conducted an unlawful census and when he was in an illicit relationship, all these things, God acted. And so now he's looking at this. He's seeing the king ripping up the law and burning it. And he's saying, God, what are you doing? Where are you? Do you not see this? And so what good is finding God's law if God's law isn't enforced? He said he wasn't going to leave the guilty unpunished, but the guilty are allowed to thrive. And so then we go back to the same kind of thoughts in Psalm 73 there we just read a second ago. My feet stumbled. My feet nearly stumbled. I looked around and I saw that everything was going good for the people who were doing wrong, and I couldn't reconcile it. And I almost tripped because of it. Chris, did you have something to say?
Yeah, to the point of how, so in the past, God acted. When sin occurred, God acted. And as Christians, I think that's something we struggle with, is God does not give signs and wonders anymore. So it's easier for us to have those doubts of God, why aren't we doing anything?
Right. It is. I mean, there's not a better way to say that. Yeah. It's very easy for us to have those doubts. And it's tripped up a lot of us, doesn't it? I mean, you know, you're trying to have a Bible study with somebody and they say, well, if he's a loving God, why isn't he doing something about that? Why doesn't he care about that? If he's a loving God, why does this thing happen? Or why does this sin exist? Why does sin exist? if he's a loving God? These are questions that we have to grapple with. I know it sounds like I'm belaboring the point, but this is not just a dilemma that Habakkuk has to deal with. This is a dilemma that we all have to deal with. There are questions that we will ask based on the things that we see and we experience and we see around us. And we will not always get a direct or immediate answer to those questions. We've got to be able to grapple with that. We've got to. Because if we can't, we will falter, as the psalmist says in Psalm 73. Okay? So the law is ineffective, and that word ineffective, tapug, it means numb or paralyzed. It's as if the law has fallen asleep like a limb. You can't even move it or pick it up. It's weak. It can't do anything. And he says justice comes out perverted, mikal. It means twisted. It's as if a limb was stunted. You bound up a limb when it was in its formatory, the umbilical cord or something got wrapped around it. And so when the child came out, the limb was stunted. That is what the justice has become in Habakkuk's eyes. All right, well, I told you, Habakkuk asked the question. I don't know if he was expecting a response. I think he probably hoped for one. God gave him one. Let's look at God's response. Verses 5 through 11. Look at the nations and observe. Be utterly astounded. For I am doing something in your days that you will not believe when you hear about it. Look, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter, impetuous nation that marches across the earth's open spaces to seize territories not its own. They are fierce and terrifying. Their views of justice and sovereignty stem from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards and more fierce than wolves of the night. Their horsemen charge ahead. Their horsemen come from distant lands. They fly like eagles swooping to devour. All of them come to do violence. Their faces are set in determination. They gather prisoners like sand. They mock kings, and rulers are a joke to them. They laugh at every fortress and build siege ramps to capture it. Then they sweep by like the wind and pass through. They are guilty. Their strength is their God. Okay, so you look at this, you see the phrase, look and observe. Habakkuk, you're in the business of looking around you and seeing things. You keep looking. Look and observe. Something's about to happen, and you're not even going to believe it if somebody was to tell you about it. I'm not sitting still, is what God is saying. I'm not inactive, and my ears are not deaf to the cries of my people. You remember when the children of Israel were being persecuted in Egypt? How long between Joseph's family and Moses? How many years? 400 years. And then God comes down and says to Moses from the burning bush, I have heard the cries of my people. And it's just the same as when he talked to Cain. Their blood cries to me from the ground, and I'm going to act. Okay? In Habakkuk's case, though, he says, I'm going to do it in a way that you're not going to like. You're not even going to believe it if I tell you. And I'm about to tell you. So God's use of vocabulary here matches Habakkuk's complaint in verse 3. You see that? He says, look, Ra'ah, which is what Habakkuk said in verse 3. Why do you force me to look, Ra'ah, at injustice? And observe, Navat. And he says, why do your versions might say in verse 3, why do you tolerate wrongdoing? The word there, why do you observe wrongdoing? Why do you stand back and just kind of, like, oh yeah, that thing's happening, yeah. Just observe it. Why do you just watch it happen? Okay, so God says, okay, you stand back and look, you stand back and observe. Here's what's going to happen. The answer to the problem is coming in a way you won't understand. I am raising up the Chaldeans. Who are the Chaldeans? That's Babylon. That's right. Okay, very good. All right, so you go all the way back to Genesis chapter 10. Genesis chapter 10, you don't have to turn there right now, but Genesis chapter 10, when we have the table of nations from Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and we read about Nimrod. Nimrod was the one who established Nineveh. He is also the one that established the first city, Babylon. Babylon is then where the Tower of Babel is to be constructed. So that is the land of the Chaldeans. And then you skip forward a chapter in Genesis to Genesis chapter 11. Who's camping out in the land of the Chaldeans? Abraham and his family. That's right. Terah is hanging out in Ur of the Chaldees. Did you ever make that connection? That the Chaldeans and Babylonia, that's where they are. I know we do that in spiritual heritage, but you think about that. That family started in the land of the Chaldeans and then moves up to Haran and then comes down into the promised land. So what God says that he is doing is, I'm resetting you back to zero. I'm taking you back to where you came from to do a reset. Now, remember we talked about the flood before. When we talk about the flood in Genesis chapter 6, what was the flood, essentially? It was a reset of creation. That's right. The waters that God had separated in creation, he brought back together in the flood. And so creation is reset, and then a remnant of his people is allowed to live and thrive and start a new family. And from Noah comes all of us. And so Abraham, at the time that we pick up his story, he's hanging out in Haran after spending time in Ur of the Chaldees. God is resetting Judah back to their origins. All right.
It's good to point out that God called him out.
That's right. He sure did.
When he sent a servant back to his wife for Isaac, and sort of said, what if two will come? Do I take Isaac?
Right.
Oh, no, he doesn't go back.
Yeah, that's right.
But now they are going back.
That's right. That's right. You're going back because that's where you need to go to reset. And so, we wonder maybe why the Babylonians, why this time? I think that is a pretty good possibility there. And he refers to the Babylonians now, the kind of strength that they have arisen to, that bitter and impetuous nation that marches across the earth's open spaces to seize territories not its own. So, if we're looking at a map of this area, we can almost see like the red glob just growing, right, as Babylon marches their way across the land. And they become one of the largest empires of their day. They become larger than Assyria. Now, they don't last for very long. That's one thing to remember about Babylon. As strong as they were, Babylon proper only lasts about 100 years, and then it is gone. So they don't get very long. But Babylon comes, and there's some poetic symmetry here between Habakkuk's complaint and God's reply. Remember, Habakkuk's complaint is, why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Oppression and violence are right in front of me. Well, how does he describe these Chaldeans? All of them come to do violence. Their faces are set in determination. And so God is going to judge violence using violence. And he mentions in verse 4, we talked about it a second ago, twisted justice or perverted justice will be met with a nation that defines justice for itself. So there's some dramatic irony in the way that God is going to punish Judah for their sin. Now, again, Habakkuk's dilemma is our dilemma. I wanted to read this to you, and then we'll let this be the close of our thoughts for tonight. I know this is kind of a bleak place to leave it, but that just means you have to come back next week for the conclusion. So we're going to go through Habakkuk 2 and 3 next week. This is a commentary on the Minor Prophets by the John Phillips commentary series. I'd recommend this to you if you're looking for further reading. He writes this: the law always becomes paralyzed in a permissive society. Isn't that interesting? A society that allows everything paralyzes the law. And again, we talked about that this morning, didn't we, in our class? The law always becomes paralyzed in a permissive society, as we can see by simply looking around in our own land. A permissive society redefines sin. Today, a drunkard is an alcoholic. A thief is a kleptomaniac. A murderer is a victim of society. Adultery is merely having an affair. Sodomy is an alternate lifestyle. Sins that would have outraged our fathers are tolerated in the name of personal and civil rights. Today, the law is emasculated. Criminals are coddled. The death sentence has been abolished in many places, and judges slap repeat offenders on the wrist. Pleas of temporary insanity can absolve perpetrators from the penalties for the most heinous crimes. Hardened criminals can play the appeal system for years and escape with punishments far lighter than their deeds deserve. Court cases are deferred until the memories of witnesses become hazy. Judges are inconsistent, often open to bribes, and frequently more concerned with protecting than punishing the guilty. The absolute standards of morality mandated by God's law have given place to relative morality, which accommodates wickedness. The wholesale slaughter of unborn babies by abortion is condoned on the grounds of a woman's right to choose. Pornography flourishes under the guise of freedom of the press. Syndicated crime, drug trafficking, prostitution, child abuse, political corruption, and blind foreign policy contribute to the growing moral weakness of our nation. Such is the permissive society that we see, and such was the permissive society that Habakkuk saw. He came to the conclusion that the wicked doth compass about the righteous, therefore wrong judgment proceeds. In other words, the wicked outnumbered and outvoted the righteous. No wonder his nation was headed on a collision course with disaster. Again, bleak note, I know. But it should give us pause and maybe some amount of comfort to know there is nothing new under the sun. We may be concerned with God's plan. We talked about that last week. You know, in this country, we have a way to vote. We have a way to do things to try to influence our country's direction. And we should certainly take advantage of that as we have opportunity. I'm not getting political on that. I'm just saying that it's out there for us to do that. But to be so caught up in things are worse than they've ever been is not helpful at all. It will not solve problems. It will not answer your questions. And so to live in constant fear and constant depression about the world that we see around us is not going to help. So what are we going to do about that? How am I going to reconcile that? And how am I going to be able to live in a world that is the way that I just described? That's what the rest of Habakkuk is going to bring us to. So we're going to leave it there tonight, and I encourage you to come back for Habakkuk 2 and 3 next week, and we will let that be our class. Any last comments or questions or anything?
Adam, why don't you go ahead and read 398.
398. Okay. Chris, you had one last comment?
I think this book is also a very good example of how God is able to use evil to then bring about good.
Well said. Well said. And that is the case. My word, which goes forth from my mouth, will not return to me ineffective. That's the end goal. Okay. Thank you for all your comments. We'll sing number 398 in his time. Great song to end this on.